and if you don't like, 3/4 of them, it's not good. So what we found, what we do is when we go in, they say, okay, go over here for your tasting. We say, no, we're here for a glass of wine. So they send us to a different area to keep us segregated. And whoever is serving the wine, we ask them for a little sample of this, a little sample of that, and we pick our favorite wine. And on this trip, it was the dry Rieslings this year. That was our go-to wine. So when we find a wine that we both agree upon, we then just buy a bottle, have them open it, and sit and have a glass of wine. To pay $6 for a glass, and you're getting two of them, for $15 you're buying a bottle. You can do the math. So that's how we've been doing it. And it's been interesting. So we ended up going to one of the wineries, and they didn't have any place to sit down. They had very limited tables, and they were all spaced, and so you could stand outside in the 90-degree weather and have a glass of wine, and we didn't want to do that. So we ended up buying a bottle, and we went back to our campground and had a glass of wine there. So the hike we did in the national forest there, it was a 7-mile hike, and it was really beautiful. We ended up going past a pond and some old fire roads, and because of all the rain in the previous couple of weeks, it was really, really muddy, like unbelievably muddy. But it was cool. It was really a nice hike. We got to do some homework for snowmobiling. This trip was just so different from all of our other trips. We were up there for a week. We didn't travel more than 30 miles in that week. We stayed at 4 different places. I already told you about the first campground and the 2 campgrounds after that. So there's still one more night to go. It really made us appreciate going slow, and we're finding the slower we go, the more that we like RVing. Now, if there's nothing to do in an area, we get bored really fast, and we'll go, it'll drive us nuts. So we do like to have things to do in the Finger Lakes. There's plenty to do. So we found a winery that was about 5 minutes away from the campground, and they had 2 jazz guitars playing, and boy, it was beautiful. We found a shady spot, put out the chairs, and just sat overlooking the Finger Lakes with a glass of wine, listening to jazz. Beautiful. And this was overlooking Cayuga Lake. Now, Cayuga Lake, when we looked at it, I said, boy, why is the water so green? So I Googled it, and for the past few years, they've had an algae bloom up there. So there you go. So that's why it was green water. So the next day we drove over to Seneca Lake to go on a paddle, because I didn't want to put the kayak in with the blue-green algae. I have enough respiratory issues, so we decided to avoid that. But we got over to Seneca Lake, and there was a chop in the water, and it looked like it was just going to be fighting the waves. So we left there. We started driving around, and we went up to Oak Island in Waterloo, New York. We figured, well, there's a canal there, and the canal's going to be calm, so at least we can paddle there. We pulled into the town of Waterloo, and we come to find out, or recognize the area. We had been there 3 years previous, and had no idea. It's interesting. 3 years ago, we stopped there because there was a farmer's market going on. And this year, we went to go paddling. 3 years ago, when we were in Waterloo, it was 90 degrees out again. And this year was like 82. It was muggy, but it wasn't like too rough, overbearing. So we did a nice little paddle out on the canal. And then we passed Mirandas Cheese Market. Actually, we passed this big barn with a lot of cars in the parking lot and no sign, just Mirandas. So we assumed it was a winery, but we Googled it and it turned out to be a cheese market. So we stopped and we did a tasting of cheeses. And there were some good ones, not good enough for us to buy any. But it was a nice little diversion. And then we headed down to the Point Winery, or Sheldrick Point Winery on Cayuga Lake. And now this is a Harvest Host location. We weren't staying there, but we had reached out to them about staying there, and they never got back to us. So we talked to a lady there. We said we're looking for some place for Sunday night, and we had reached out for Friday night, but never heard anything. She said, "Oh, I'll talk to my boss, and I'll have him give you a call." So instead of calling, he sent us an email 7 hours later saying that unfortunately they had somebody staying there. So we weren't looking out with Harvest Hosts on this trip. Now again, we left a lot of it up in the air. Typically, we'll have wineries booked out a week in advance, and but what can you do? But what was intriguing about this winery, and one of the reasons we wanted to see it, even though we weren't going to be staying there, was there's a dock on Cayuga Lake, and you can land at their dock, walk up the hill, and have a glass of wine. It's like, wow, that's really cool. So, in the future, we're planning on buying something, either a pontoon boat or a jet ski from one extreme to the other. And we figure that's going to be a cool thing to do. So we saved it on Google Maps for the future. And we're looking forward to doing that at some point too. So that night, headed back to the RV. Trish did her workout, and I jumped in the pool for a little while, and that was really nice. The next day, we were packed up in the campground, and we were heading over to Barrel House 6 Distillery, which is a Harvest Host location. We plugged it into GPS. We were heading over there, and the GPS took us to this road that was super steep, narrow, only half paved. And I said, I don't think I want to do this in the RV. So we stopped and we started to unhook to take the Jeep up to scout it out. And just then a gentleman came over. His name happened to be Paul. And he explained that if we drove on the left side of the road up this hill, which was the paved side, that we should be able to make it in the rig. And I said, well, what happens if somebody's coming racing down the hill and we're in their lane? He says, well, that could be a problem. There was a lot of blind turns, and we just said, no way. Ain't doing it. So from there, we drove up, we looked, we found another road up to the distillery, but that road was going to be, there was a right-hand turn onto the road, and to make the right-hand turn, we would have gone into town for about a mile and a half, turn around, and come back. So we ended up, being stuck on this hill with the RV, and we still had no place to stay that night now. So we talked to this guy, Paul, who was managing a piece of property right where we had pulled in with the RV. So I asked him, what do you think about us parking here for the night? And he said, sure, absolutely. And I said, well, it's 90 degrees out, so we're going to be running our generator for the AC, and I don't want to disturb anybody. So we started up the generator. He said, no, that's fine. That's not too noisy. And this was going to be another first for us. We had never slept in the RV, running the AC strictly on a generator. Our last rig, when we did our 5-month, 6-month trip out to Montana, the first night in the Catskills in New York, our generator died the first night. So for the next 3 months until we could get the generator fixed, had to find places when it was 90 degrees, 100 degrees, 115 degrees out in South Dakota. We had to find places that had 30 amp. So we became conditioned that we want 30 amp to camp. And this is what we've been doing for 3 years now. And so this night, sitting there in this parking lot, it was going to force us to get away from the umbilical cord of a 30 amp plug-in and do it the way that the RVs were built to be done. Start up the generator, run your AC, and go from there. So we did. Unfortunately, at 7 o'clock in the morning, we like to sleep till about 8 or so. Around 7, the town came in to do some paving. They had a little bulldozer front end loader thing, and it flipped off the road, fell into a drain, a gulch, and was stuck there. So for the next hour, they were trying to figure out how to get this thing out. They had tractors running, cables, and so we got up. We offered to pack up early and get out of their way, and they were glad for that. And so we stayed for the night in our RV with AC running on a generator. Yay. That night, it was going to be, or that day rather, it was going to be in the 90s. The next day was going to be in the 90s. So we weren't sure what we were going to be doing. We're looking at a couple of harvest host locations, and so we figured, well,